Mike knew who Crazy Grady was, of course. He'd often seen him slouched on the corner of Main Street and Northwest Cedar, with his mangy yellow dog stretched out on a dirty coat laid on the sidewalk beside him and a handwritten "Will Work for Food" sign propped up on the low stone fence behind his skinny legs. Sometimes the man pushed a grocery cart laden with plastic bags filled with dirty clothes past the building sites and houses Mike was working on. Mumbling to himself and smoking the ends of discarded cigarettes he'd gathered from the gutter while his dog trotted nonchalantly along behind him. However, this peaceful riverside setting deep in the woods was a good solid couple of hours away from the nearest highway and even further away from town, and it was not an environment where he'd ever thought he'd see Crazy Grady. Adam echoed his thoughts as the man drew closer. What's he doing all the way out here? He hasn't got his dog with him. His dog is always with him. Clipper. The dog's name is Clipper. Mike briefly wondered how Adam knew this, and then Adam was raising his voice to call out. "Hey, Grady. Didn't expect to see you out here." Crazy Grady stopped short before reaching the men, leaving a safe distance between them. Safe for whom? Mike had heard people say that Crazy Grady had spent time in prison, but the reasons given for his incarceration varied wildly from murder to traffic offenses, and Mike didn't know how many valid grains of truth were stacked up behind any of those reasons. Crazy Grady was one of those people of an indeterminable age. After a good scrub, a haircut, and a beard trim, he might pass for a worldly 40-year-old, but Mike suspected his real age was closer to 50. He was lean but not skeleton thin, and something about the way he carried himself hinted that he might once have been an intelligent man with a real life of his own. However, he seldom looked people in the eye. Not that Mike had ever gone out of his way to look Crazy Grady in the eye, and he was prone to muttering or even shouting his thoughts out loud. "Where's your yellow dog?" Adam asked, friendly-like, as if they were two friends meeting on the street. Crazy Grady looked haughtily down his nose, somehow managing to pull his eyes in closer to the bridge to make himself look mean rather than crazy. He looked to the side of Adam's head rather than right at him as he responded. "Mustard. He's a mustard-colored dog." "Whatever." Adam wasn't perturbed by the correction. "We don't often see you without him." Crazy Grady shrugged and stared past the men at the river. He was wearing his green outfit today. Mike had noticed that he always wore one of only 3 outfits, in almost matching colors of green, brown, or blue, and his shirt and pants were the color of old moss or perhaps a mildewed bathroom ceiling. "How did you get out here?" Adam persisted, probing for information. Crazy Grady lazily fumbled in his trouser pocket for a stub of cigarette. "Hitched a ride. It's not against the law. Everyone knows there's only one road in or one road out to this part of the woods, but it seems that there's always someone traveling this way." Funny thing that Mike was already done with this pointless conversation with the town's resident madman. He turned away from the other 2 men, eyeing up the bend in the river which would lead him to where Joe was now peacefully fishing in unmolested solitude. Joe had the right idea. Joe might even have a fish on the end of his line by now. "Well," he said, "guess I might go and find Joe. I'll be with you shortly." Adam lifted the trout net in a casual wave and Mike walked away, not bothering to say goodbye to Crazy Grady as he left. As he moved away, he heard Adam ask the other man how long he planned to stay out here. Adam had always been like that, genial and friendly to everyone, willing to give the time of day to the sort of people that most others wouldn't even notice. Mike hiked along the riverbank as the first golden rays of sunshine sparkled through the trees on the other side of the river. He would have preferred to have a line in the water by now, but the series of small disruptions to the morning had used up far too much time. Well, at least he had yesterday's catch to gloat over. Joe gave him a nod as he found himself a spot near where he'd hauled in the trout and cast out his line. Adam joined them 5 minutes later, and none of the men spoke as they each concentrated on their own activities. Mike was aware of Crazy Grady walking behind them at one point, and he saw him continue to walk upstream for a short distance. But he didn't pay the man too much attention. It was a free country, and if the town bum wanted to walk aimlessly along the riverbed out here in the middle of nowhere, that was his prerogative. "Who were you talking to before?" Joe called out as Mike cast out his line. aiming for the cool blue water beneath a stand of willow trees on the other bank. Joe, lost in his own world, apparently hadn't noticed Crazy Grady walk past earlier. I heard Adam yelling out to someone. It was just old Crazy Grady from town. Mike listened with satisfaction to the plop of the lure hitting the surface of the water. If he wasn't mistaken, there was another big old trout waiting in that pool for the right guy to come along and catch him. It's the right kind of weather for lunatics, Joe chortled. He's a long way from home, aren't we all? Mike fell silent as he slowly wound in his line, waiting for the sharp tug that didn't come. Not this time perhaps, but he wasn't going to give up that easily. He cast out again, too far this time, and swore as the lure hit an overhanging switch of willow. He yanked the line back to pull it free and the lure plunged into the river, followed by a small shower of willow leaves. Adam crunched his way across the stones to join them. I might go upstream a little further. No sense in all of us fishing in the same pool. Mike looked around, but there was no sign of the Crazy Grady. The sun was higher now and the rays glared off the brilliant white-gray of the river stones, making him scrunch up his eyes. Somewhere in the trees, a bird called out an urgent cack-cack-cack of alarm before its call was abruptly halted. Where did old Crazy go? Adam flapped his hand in front of his face, shooing away a small swarm of midges. Dunno. He's wandered off somewhere. I'm gonna try that new bully lure today. There's a fish out there with my name on, and it's about time the two of us were introduced. He's still there, Sandy reported on her return from the edge of the clearing, where she'd gone to get a better view of the gathering storm clouds. The temperature had dropped too, the earlier sunshine now nothing more than a distant memory. He's sitting out there on a boulder staring at the river. He gives me the creeps. Why is he here? We don't own the riverbank, Joe said mildly. He has as much right as we have to come out here and hang out. You can't go telling people what they can and can't do. He used a fork to flip over the sizzling, pale orange fish fillets that lay in the pan on the fire. He'd been the only successful fisherman this morning, and therefore it was his prerogative to cook his catch however he saw fit. A haze of fragrant blue smoke hung low over the clearing, unbothered by errant puffs of wind. The weather seemed to have taken a moment to pause and be still while it decided on its next move. I was talking to him earlier, said Adam. He said he comes out here quite a bit. He likes the space and freedom. I can understand that. He accosted me when I went looking for some more firewood. He told me that people die out here. Louise dropped another thick, chubby stick of wood onto the fire and Joe frowned at her when a shower of sparks shot up into the air, protectively pulling his pan off the fire until the sparks died away. People do die out here, said Mike. That's not a big secret. He walked across from their tent with a pot of chicken soup, although that was probably a far too descriptive a name for the few cups of water, the sprinkling of dehydrated vegetables, the handful of macaroni, and the sachet of insipid yellow powdered Rooster Booster that the pot contained. Amber had said she couldn't face anything more than that for lunch today, and he was happy to oblige. Anything to keep the little mama happy. Accosted, Sandy looked sharply at Louise. Did he touch you? No, nothing like that. I was collecting firewood, as I said, and he suddenly spoke from behind me. I nearly peed my pants. Anyway, I turned around and he was leaning against a tree trunk and gazing up into the branches a few feet away from where I stood. I asked what he wanted and he said nothing, that he was just passing the time of day. I grabbed my bundle of sticks and was about to leave when he said people die out here. She lifted one thin shoulder in a shrug. He didn't say it ominously or anything like that. He just kind of dropped it out there. But it was still a creepy thing to say. Sandy gave a dramatic, overdone shudder, one that made the soft rolls under her chin shake and wobble. She tossed her head aggressively enough to make her ponytail swing. See? He is creepy. What kind of person says that sort of thing to a stranger in the woods? He was probably talking about those two kids. It has been all over the news for weeks. I don't see what's so strange about him mentioning it. Mike pressed the pot of soup down into the hot embers to cook and peered hungrily into the pan of fish. Looks almost done. Could do with a mite longer, Joe murmured, determined to do it his way. Mike glanced back at the tent, which was open with the fly rolled back on each side. Amber had bunched up their sleeping bags into a nest of sorts and was sitting regally in the middle of the pile with an open book in front of her. She looked content. Mike grinned to himself and settled down on his haunches. Those clouds are much thicker and darker than they were an hour ago. I think we're going to get a drenching. Sandy began to lay out some plates for lunch. What? Amber finally joined in the conversation, calling out from inside the tent. I thought someone said something about us getting a shower or two. There's a big difference between a shower or two and a drenching. I don't want to stay out here in a shitty, leaky tent if it's going to storm. She tossed her book aside, sighing as she clambered out of the tent. Let me see these clouds. Adam? Sandy looked to her husband, the most experienced camper in the group. He came from a long, proud line of outdoorsmen, as he often said. His father had even written a book about camping in the wilderness once, based on his own adventures as a young man going it alone in the wilds of Alaska. It does look like a storm is brewing. What do you say we do? Adam made a show of licking the tip of his index finger and holding it up in the air, as if to test the direction of the non-existent breeze. We're quite sheltered in here. We'll miss the worst of it. The tree canopy forms a natural shelter. Mike went to join Amber at the gap in the trees. The clouds were thick and black above the line of trees across the other side of the river, and they looked as if they meant business. Those clouds are holding onto a solid parcel of rain. Amber annoyingly inserted a whine into her voice, which she did whenever she planned on getting her own way. I don't want to stay out here in a storm. You know, I've always been scared of thunderstorms. We should have checked the weather forecast properly before we left home. The weather can change quickly out here. Yesterday's predicted shower can develop into a storm with very little notice. You know what I said about it being a microclimate? He was no longer watching the building clouds, more interested now in what Crazy Grady was doing. The man had a stick of wood and he was bent almost in two, intently poking holes into the sandy sediment down by the river. Back in a minute. I want to know what he's doing. I'm going to tell the others that we want to leave, she yelled after him. Mike ignored her, quickening his step as Crazy Grady turned away from the sand-covered beach and began to walk swiftly away downriver, using the stick as a walking pole now. Hey Grady, what's up? Crazy Grady stopped, but he took his time in turning around to face him. Now that Mike was closer, he could see the way his eyes were shrunk back deep into his skull. Not that he allowed his gaze to meet Mike's, of course. As he'd done with Adam earlier, he kept his stare fixed on a point somewhere past Mike's ear. There's a storm coming, he said flatly. Yeah? Mike took an involuntary step backwards. He just got a whiff of that same bottom of the dumpster stench he'd smelled back in the trees, and it made his stomach do a slow, queasy roll. What was so interesting back there in the sand? The wilds like to keep their own secrets. He drawled the words, playing them off his tongue as if savoring the taste of them. I guess. Mike shoved his hands deep into the pockets of his cargo shorts, wishing he'd never bothered trying to strike up a conversation with the man. Nut job. Crazy Grady nodded slowly, and his eyes swiveled across to latch onto Mike's other ear. Mother Nature learned long ago that she has the power to do whatever she pleases. Can't see that changing anytime soon. Okie dokie, time to go. Poke the crazies at your own risk, Mike. Well, I should get back to my wife. There's a storm coming, Crazy Grady said again, flinging his stick to one side. It clattered loudly against the boulders before lying still. He dug around in his filthy, frayed pocket for a cigarette stub, and his eyes finally landed on Mike's for the briefest of moments before darting away again. He sounded normal again now, like someone with his wits still intact. You good folks really should find someplace to keep yourselves safe. Ed said something about an old cabin or hunter's hut not too far away from here, Joe mused, gazing through the trees in the opposite direction to the way they'd walked in. We could try and find it. Why don't we just go back to where we left our cars and head on home? The idea of a hot shower and eating a home-delivered pizza in his living room in front of the TV, followed by an interrupted night's sleep in his own bed, was enticing to Mike. Now that the weather had turned, he decided he'd had his fill of the outdoors for now, and hey, he'd caught the fish he'd been hoping for. They'd spent a night in a tent and they'd downed beers around the fire just as they'd planned. All the boxes had been ticked, and besides, he had Amber and the baby to think about. As she'd said, storms frightened her, and wasn't it dangerous to scare a pregnant woman? Make your choice, but the cabin sounds as if it'll be a lot closer to reach than the parking lot, and that storm isn't going to hold itself back for long. We're looking at an hour and a half to 2 hours of vigorous hiking to get back to the vehicles from here, and under rapidly deteriorating conditions. Adam immediately sided with Joe, as if finding the cabin had been their plan all along, although he didn't seem to be in any hurry to get moving. He'd just cracked open another can of beer, and he was halfway through the bag of pretzels that he'd chosen to chase his trout meal down with. Can everyone just make up their minds? Amber yanked the tent pole out, causing their tent to immediately deflate into a large fabric pancake. I don't care where we go, but we gotta leave before the storm starts. Did Ed give you actual directions on how to get to the cabin, or was it just some comment that he made in passing? Louise asked, obviously well used to asking Joe the important questions. I say we head back to the parking lot. Mike, come and help me pack up. Amber aimed a disgruntled kick at the deflated tent. You know how to fold this thing up and get it back into its bag. He said it was about 20 minutes further on from the clearing, Joe said. He scratched at his head and turned in a slow circle, a bit like a compass needle. I reckon we need to go back to that fork in the track and take the path on the right. Mike remembered the high-pitched chirping noise he'd heard when he ventured a short way down the right-hand trail. He could hear it in his mind again now, but his brain still didn't have any answers as to what it might have been. He shoved the memory down and went to help Amber dismantle the tent. 20 minutes? But it's at least 20 minutes back to the fork. Is the cabin 20 minutes away from that point, which would make it 40 minutes walk from here? Louise was still trying to get some accurate directions out of Joe. Mike secretly wished her well in her mission. Joe had always been either frustratingly vague or overly elaborate when it came to apparently irrelevant things such as measurements, instructions, and directions. Already, Mike had heard him refer to the 8-pound trout he'd caught this morning as around 10-pound, and that was just within their close group. Once he started bragging to his other buddies, the traditional fisherman's exaggeration would take hold. The traditional Joe exaggeration, and to make it even more theatrical, each one was generally accompanied by the appropriate hand gestures. Yeah, my car goes this fast, my wage packet is this size, my dick is this big. Mike laughed out loud, but he hurriedly turned it into a grunt when Amber threw him a fierce glare. This isn't funny, Mike. I'm so mad that we've gotten ourselves into this situation. She lowered her voice to a careful whisper to prevent the others from overhearing. Especially considering my condition. He bit back a flash of annoyance. Hey, I didn't know about your condition before we left home. SHH. She returned his scowl of irritation with a mean frown of her own. Keep your voice down. Mike pointedly put his back to her. He pulled the tent into a flat rectangle shape and began to fold it in on itself. The wind had picked up already, howling through the treetops and bringing its own warning along with it. They would have to head for the cabin. 40 or so minutes of hiking opposed to the couple of hours it would take to get back to the vehicles made the decision a no contest. Adam burped and set his beer can down on the grass as Sandy began to flap around like a bird with a broken wing, snatching plates and bowls up before dropping them into a heap and turning her attention to something else. We need to hurry. I just felt a raindrop. The embers in the fire pit are too hot to leave, Louise fretted. We need someone to get some water from the river to dampen them down. A forest fire is the last thing we want. It's going to rain anyway, Joe pointed out. I'll go. Mike was glad for the chance to leave for a few minutes and remove himself from the frantic, almost panicked atmosphere that had taken hold of the clearing. Camping was supposed to be a relaxed affair, but the mood was currently as zen-like as an army troop preparing for an ambush. He grabbed one of the empty plastic water bottles and set off for the river as Sandy snapped at Adam to put down the beer and move his sorry ass to help. The black clouds had lowered further now to rudely embrace the tops of the trees, as malevolent as a vengeful lover. Crazy Grady was nowhere to be seen, but curiosity led Mike over to the sandy patch where he'd seen the man thrusting his stick into the loamy soil. He scuffed at the sand with his shoe, kicking at the holes that dotted the sand. A couple of them had already filled with water, seepage from the nearby river. But there was something. He squatted down beside the nearest hole, trying to make out what those greenish, egg-shaped clusters were. Some kind of fungus? Spider eggs? The weird roots of some of the scrubby plants striving to make a home for themselves amongst the barren expanse of riverbed stones? He picked up a small twig and poked it experimentally at one of the little globes. The sphere gave a little under the weight of his poking, but it didn't separate from the rest of the cluster. He felt rather than saw a shadow pass overhead, temporarily darkening his vision, but he didn't take any notice until his brain prodded him with the realization that shadows didn't generally show up in the absence of sunshine. He absent-mindedly looked up at the charcoal-colored clouds, and a single, icy drop of rain landed on his cheek, just beneath his eye in an echo of a tear. "Mike!" Sandy shouted at him from where she now stood at the mouth of the clearing. "We're ready to go. Bring the water for the fire and then we'll head away." "Yeah." He gave the sphere that he'd been poking one last robust jab. This time, it broke away from the cluster and dropped further into the hole. His interest now gone, Mike tossed the twig to one side and went to fill the water bottle just as somewhere in the forest. Yet another bird gave strident voice to its anger, frustration, or fear.